Welcome to our training, Getting More Donors, how to find more supporters for your cause. I'm very excited to be here with you all. And before we move into the content for today and I introduce David, I wanted to say a couple really quick things about the Fundraising for Health Justice Project, because I know, at least Sophia, I think this is your first training. So this project has been going since last summer. It is a project for the organizations that are part of the Voices for Health Justice cohort that is supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And Fundraising for Health Justice is a project that helps organizations strengthen their fundraising programs. And we do that in a variety of ways, including trainings like this, that are one-time trainings that you're welcome to participate in and or watch the recordings later. We have consultants available to work one-on-one with you, and I know at least a couple of you are already doing that, one of you with David, our trainer. And we also have specific support around doing funder briefings. So the fundraising assistance is both for your individual donor and community-based fundraising activities, as well as foundation and institutional funding support. And some of you are already working with your consultant around the possibility of hosting funder briefings to introduce new funders to your work. So that's kind of the brief overview. If you have more questions about what's available and you haven't been engaged beyond coming today, please do get in touch with Ambar Pinto, who is here with us and is our project manager. Ambar, Marjorie Fine, and I are the three leads of this project, and Ambar is always available to you for questions, support, connecting you with the resources that you need. So I think that's enough about the project. For today's session, I want to, encourage any of you who are willing and able to turn your videos on to do so, just because it really helps us engage with each other. So please feel free to do that, or I encourage you to do that, I should say. We also want to start the session by having you all introduce yourselves in chat. So David, do you want to say a little bit about that? And then I'll come back and say a little bit more about the session.
Yeah, let me quickly share my screen. It's wonderful to see everyone, or meet everyone for now. Yeah, but if you're able to, while we're going to keep chatting for a little bit in terms of just welcomes, introductions, and setting the stage, but if you could, for those that, if you're not on video, but hopefully you're still at a computer, would love if you're able to put your name, organization, and just what you'd like to explore today in the chat. It is a small group, so we're excited about that we can really dig in about what y'all are thinking about in particular, and really aiming to try and there's so much we could feasibly talk about in this topic. So we're really excited to hear more about what is actually going to be most applicable and interesting for y'all, and be able to have that conversation, so that hopefully by the end of this, you have a few tangible ideas of things you can take away. So if you're able to, if you're in a place you can put your name, organization, and just any kind of ideas or things you're thinking about or things you'd like to explore, that's really helpful in the chat.
Great. Thanks, David. And yes, I encourage everyone to do that. I didn't actually properly introduce myself. I'm Stephanie Roth. I'm principal of Klein and Roth Consulting. I use she, her, they pronouns. And I have been working in the field of fundraising with mostly social justice, nonprofit organizations for more decades than I care to count, but since the 1980s. And really pleased to be here with you all and to support the important work you're doing to bring health justice and equity to communities around the country. In terms of housekeeping for today, Ambar did put her email address and phone number, but she's also available through chat for any technical issues or challenges you're having. So Ambar's available for that. She also helps us monitor the chat and remind both David and myself of things people are asking if we miss those comments. Glad to see Ellen from the Maine Center for Economic Policy introducing herself. Karen Katigbak from Apano. That's great. And let's see, what else did I want to say about housekeeping? Oh, at the end of the session, there'll be some announcements, so please do stay on. We won't run overtime, but we'll spend the last couple minutes with announcements and making sure you know where to get the survey for giving us an evaluation of the session. And let's see, is there anything else? If you have questions, I know David is fine with you raising your hand or putting a question in chat throughout the session. you don't have to wait until the end. He'll explain more about the process. But there's both waving your hand like this and putting the raise hand function from Zoom and writing in the chat. Okay, so without further ado, I'd love to introduce David Alexander, who has been working with a variety of social justice, LGBTQ and Jewish organizations for the past several decades. And he's currently the Vice President of Development for the Decolonizing Wealth Project, which I'd love for him to say one or two words about when he introduces himself. But he has really extensive experience, and I'm really thrilled that he's able to spend this next hour and a half with us. One thing that I think is particularly striking to me, or just helpful in terms of this context, is that I know a lot of the work that you all do is around healthcare policy and policy change, and that can sometimes feel like a hard sell to the community. You're not necessarily doing direct service or engaging on the ground with people, and so messaging what it is you're doing and encouraging people to support you as individuals can feel challenging. It's not insurmountable, and David has a lot of experience with policy-oriented kinds of organizations. So I think any questions you have around that and how you make the case for support to a broad base of individual donors is something he's really well equipped to answer. So without further ado, here's David.
Thank you, Stephanie. Again, it's a pleasure to see you all. I think I've met a couple folks, Sophia, and I think Jennifer, we met before, had a conversation before as well. Good to see you. Yeah, so David Alexander, excited to be doing this work with the Fundraising for Health Justice program for the past several months. As Stephanie mentioned, I am doing work in addition as the VP of Development with the Decolonizing Wealth Project, which was born out of 5 years ago, the book Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva, which was really a critique on philanthropy. And the focus of the organization is really on working with philanthropy and wealthy individuals through a process of repair and redistribution to move resources to Black and Indigenous-led organizations. So organization's been around for 5 years. I just started with them a couple months ago and really excited to be doing that work. So thank you for those who put some information in the chat. That's really helpful to help guide our conversation. As I mentioned earlier on, for those that joined, perhaps didn't hear, the goal, I mean, it is a smallish group. So the goal really is to try and make this as applicable as possible to things you're interested in. So wherever you are in your organization and how you're thinking about donor acquisition, really try and love to focus attention in ways that are going to be helpful. So one of the things I'd love to do, and let me go to the next slide, is we have a couple quick polls I'd love to run. If you could throw those up, Avery, perfect, thank you. And would just love to get a quick sense of different ways folks are thinking about acquisition, doing acquisition right now. And we'll have this one up for a few seconds if folks just want to select those. And then we'll do another one quickly that's similarly talking about areas that folks are most interested in talking about today. Folks are doing right now, events and social, not as much direct mail, not as much board engagement. And then the next poll, just about what folks might be most interested in for today. Great. Okay, so it looks like social media is of interest, email marketing. So people are doing events, but still interested in events. And then some direct mail and some board engagement and a little bit of the peer-to-peer stuff. Okay, that's really helpful. So the other thing I'm thinking about, I'm going to cover some kind of high-level thinking ideas conceptually about approaching donor acquisition. And throughout, again, it's a relatively small group of us, so welcome questions as we go into it. And as we hit some of these various categories, if there's things we want to dig into, we can spend the time what feels like it's going to be, again, most helpful for everyone. Thank you for that. So then the other thing to note as we're doing this is that there's so much to feasibly do with this work. So I don't have all the answers, and these things change regularly, and there's data in different areas that one could look at in terms of how things are being, there's infinite amounts of data to unpack, which is actually what I think is most fascinating about some donor acquisition work in particular, is it's so strategic, and it always feels like a deep puzzle to try and understand what the organizations I'm working with, how we're building out our specific program and what's resonating with folks. I think one of the stories I often share, and Sophia, will be redundant for you, but that I led on about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, with a couple organizations ago I was working with on a direct marketing package that we mailed out for acquisition purposes. And we had a membership card for an organization I was working for. And we did a simple test of, I think it was like we were running behind and wanted to test something. So we did a simple test and tested whether people resonated more with a green membership card versus a purple membership card, which seems like the silliest and most simple thing, but we threw it out there because we kind of didn't have time and we're like, let's just pick a couple colors on the membership card. And it was the most dramatic difference in response rate that we had seen in any testing based on just these two colors and an acquisition mailing that we had done. So it's these things where it can differ so much based on audience, but thinking about what you're testing, capturing that data, knowing your audience, and actually doing the testing and thinking about that. So I mentioned that as well, and that we all have a lot of these experiences. So I'm really eager that as we're talking about these things, that other folks have experiences, ideas, things that worked well for you, things that were challenges or didn't work well for you that you'd love to share. That's as much as we can make this conversational and lean on our collective wisdom, I think that will be really powerful as well. So I have plenty of stories I can share about my years of doing this and welcome others to also jump in and share. So to dive in on overall approach, um, we're going to cover a lot of different ideas, all those different areas that we pulled about a second ago. I'm going to touch on each of those a little bit. So again, there's so much, each one of these areas could be a 2-hour presentation in itself, if not more. So I'm going to touch on some high level ideas and thinking. And again, happy to answer questions, lead in some conversation and dig in different areas. But why don't we start high level? And then from there, the plan is we'll have time, 15-minute breakouts for folks to then think about some of these ideas and how they're looking at acquisition in their groups, to then engage with others about what's worked, what hasn't worked. I'll jump into some of those conversations as well so we can dig in a little more. Hopefully some of what we talk about will resonate and you can think about, oh, okay, this is an idea that I can take back and will hopefully help me in acquiring some new donors. And then we'll come back together, discuss some of that, and then have a little further conversation if there are particular things. Yeah, so let's dig in. So I think high level, one of the things I wanted to talk about before we dig into specific approaches is just really looking at the importance of acquisition and the increased importance of acquisition. So there's a couple things to think about here. One is that I put this together kind of this pyramid of a donor program. And in a way, I look at this as ROI at a ROI basis. ROI basis is what I'm trying to say. So we have renewal and retention is the basis of any program. So the easiest and most affordable, most cost-effective way of continuing to build out a strong program is going to be having a strong renewal and retention, bringing your donors on year after year and making sure there's strong engagement to encourage those donors to continue to give to an organization. Regardless of that, what we've seen in over a couple decades is that retention rates continue to decrease. There's a lot of noise out there. There's increasing number of organizations, but based on at least the fundraising effectiveness project in Q3 of last year, they saw annual retention rates for donors at a low of 41%, which is actually, it seems about average to what we've kind of seen, like between 40 and 50% in a number of different places. But it's still, it means at 41%, it means that every year you're losing about 60% of your donor base and needing to find opportunities to either reinstate those donors or have a new funnel of donors that you're bringing in. So reinstatement here, what I mean by that is what I see as the next tier of opportunity for ROI purposes, that it is cost effective, that if someone is given to the organization before, they already have that attachment, there's a strong opportunity to bring those donors back into the fold. So that also feels very important for a program to be able to have that continued conversation and strategies and figure out ways to bring people back in, because that is going to be much easier to achieve. And then the last piece is acquisition, what we're talking about today. So even with some of the organizations that I've worked with, the best I've ever seen in terms of retention rates and engagement has been at around 80%, which is very, very high. But even for that organization, it meant that every year, 20% of their donors were not returning. So it meant that they could have some reinstatement efforts, but that was still a significant number of donors that they needed to have acquisition programs in place to bring new donors into the fold and in order to continue building out the strength of that program. What else did I want to note here? I think the other thing I would say here in terms of this piece is that we'll get into this in a couple other areas as well. But when I was looking at this data in particular and some of the latest information about retention rates, was that while we're looking at 41% of renewal, that's for renewal for individuals that traditionally make one gift per year to an organization. And when you start looking at donors who are sustainers, who are making monthly gifts, or even for individuals that just made a second gift, could be at any point in time, but made a second gift to an organization, renewal rates actually go up pretty significantly. And if they make a third or fourth gift at any point, it could be like a year-end gift and then an event gift. But the number of times an individual donor gives per year actually was very powerful in increasing retention rate. And before we, Stephanie, was there anything you'd like to add here before we move on?
Yeah, thanks, David. I was going to say, one thing I always say about donor acquisition is that if you're not committed to what it takes to retain donors, stay in touch with them, engage with them, ask them again, it's not worth doing acquisition, because acquisition is way harder. It's way lower rates of return on what you send out, what kind of communication. So it doesn't make sense even financially or in terms of the time you're putting in to do donor acquisition without a strong retention strategy. So just, I know I encourage David not to focus on retention this session, but just to keep that in mind. The other thing is, when I was first in fundraising several decades ago, a normal retention rate was around 65%. So the fact that it's now 41% is really, really kind of a challenge. And so this is just the industry standard. I've worked with organizations who have more like 60, 70% retention rates now, because they have invested so much effort into staying in touch with their donors and keeping them engaged. So just to know, you don't have to match the industry standard. It's just the trend overall that's kind of hard, but you can build on that and do much better. Thanks, David.
Sure thing. So the next piece to touch on, just in terms of overall framing, is what I put together here that I call an engagement continuum. So this is a little more philosophical in my mind, but this is how I think about when I'm bringing on new donors, that all of these pieces matter. But what I mean when I have these categories here is that when I think about the programs I've worked on, we have material engagement. And by that, I mean someone has made an initial donation to the organization because we gave them something. They got a sticker, they got a water bottle. And that's often the relationship they have, which is great. And that's a great way to bring folks in, but that's a certain level of engagement with the organization that's not as deep as one I would like it to be. So always thinking about that as a great hook, but it is a material relationship that they often have. So by solidarity, I mean that it might be an individual who's aligned with the mission of the organization. They similarly believe that all people should have housing and fair housing. They're in line with what our mission is as an organization. So getting people to that place where there's that alignment with mission. And then ideology is deeper, where you're actually looking at people who understand and are aligned with the theory of change of an organization. And then what I've seen is that by being able to have those deeper conversations with folks, could be bringing them in through that material interaction, but then having that continued engagement and getting them to a place that they're actually engaging and more deeply aligned with the broader theory of change and work of the organization is where I've found greater retention. So then I also note here just quickly for high level notes is the importance of multi-channel fundraising. So this is also, as we're going through these things, again, I mean, I think we all know this, but there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that we'll be able to do that's going to bring in all the new donors that we want. That it's really looking at all the various pieces together and thinking about how they can complement each other. I think examples I would give is that I've definitely done physical and in-person and virtual events in the past where the goal of those was around major donor acquisition or engagement opportunities, where what we found was that they were good for low-level donors, but the connection that we had at the organization had not effectively built out that pipeline where we were identifying, qualifying, and moving people into major giving prospective programs. So looking at those disconnects and really understanding what are the many ways that we're doing fundraising, how do those pieces interconnect, and how are we bringing new donors in, and what does that mean for the various other components things we're looking at, which leads to this last piece I'm thinking about here just in terms of high level framing. With acquisition, as you're bringing new donors in, it's also thinking about doing the qualification of what is the process of, say you bring in, you are able to build out a pretty solid acquisition program. You have a retention rate of X, so you're trying to top that off every year with bringing in X number of donors that's going to make up for those that you've lost. And as those donors are coming in, having mechanisms in place where you can do some even basic qualification to know if those folks have opportunities to be a major donor, to be moving them to a monthly donor, even a small level for retention purposes. And then in the near term or the very long term, looking at them as a plan giving prospect. So why don't we start with direct mail? So I chose to start with this one in particular because I think often people, I feel certainly around COVID years, people stepped back significantly. And historically, a lot of organizations have stepped back from doing a lot of direct mail. I think a lot of the numbers have also retreated around direct mail. But I certainly still argue that as going back to kind of that multi-channel opportunity, that finding ways of including mail is still a good opportunity of having a multi-channel touch. So it could be for acquisition purposes or for the broader program of an organization, but having those pieces where people might be seeing your emails, they might be seeing the organization out in the media on news hits, might be seeing the organization doing events, but also getting that piece of mail is also very valuable in my mind, in my experience. One of the things, so I worked at a few organizations ago where we had a very extensive direct mail program. This was about 10 years ago. So I certainly think the numbers have changed a bit and it's a bit more of a harder landscape to do direct mail and marketing more effectively. But even through that program, our acquisition efforts, we'd be looking at, we'd send out thousands of pieces of mail trying to get like that be the first time a donor made a gift to the organization. And if we received a 1% response rate, that was fantastic. You might send thousands of these pieces out and you're only getting 1% of folks back. They're really looking at what the ROI on that is. And usually on average, the first gift was only about $35. So it really is, especially with something like direct mail, you're looking at long game, but you're looking at an opportunity for how does this fit into perhaps let's say a 5-year plan and trying to build out acquisition strategies and do it in a way that's also relatively cost effective. So in looking at just a $35 donation, 1% response rate, we were really looking at, when we were doing it, we had a cost per acquisition of about $100. So should we be able to retain that donor, it was about a 3-year length span until we were able to return the revenue based on the investment for that donor, which is where the qualification piece comes in, that ideally some of these donors are moving into monthly programs, planned programs, giving programs, but it was still an important component of how we were bringing in new donors to the organization that could then move into these programs or just continue to give at these lower level, mid-level donor areas. I mentioned here the cost investment and considerations because it certainly is expensive. And I think we probably all still get to some degree. Some of the larger institutions that are out there will still send pretty weighty packages where you'll get a calendar or a newsletter or a sticker or something like that that is a pretty sizable package. You can just tell how expensive everything is. A couple of things that I think have worked and that I've seen work have been anything from a very basic newsletter that's mailed out. I see this often from politicians, but I think it's worked well with nonprofit organizations as well, where it might be like the 4-pager that's folded, like 8.5 by 11 folded and sealed. Is something that sometimes works well. And something that we tested at an organization I was most recently with was instead of trying to put a heavy package together, just sending out postcards with QR codes, which everyone now uses constantly, and having that to be able to make a pitch and direct people back to a donation page, or to, if there was something timely or topical, which was very critical that was happening in that moment, being able to time that messaging about programming. So while I was working at a think tank, we could have like a seminal report that was coming out that felt very timely to things that might be happening more topically in the moment, and then have a QR code where people could go to a landing page where they could see the report and also make a donation. And we saw some good response, both in terms of engagement around that being one of the multi-channels where it could be existing donors, but then also being able to rent lists, trade lists with other organizations and use that as a more cost-effective mechanism, which also saved a lot of time and resources. I think the other thing I would note here is just around the audience targeting, and we'll get into this with digital engagement as well, that with all of these, it's the opportunity for one, this testing that you're doing around these pieces in as much as possible, but then also looking at, there's a lot of opportunities for understanding audience. So really looking at knowing who the targets are when you're looking at donor acquisition, who you think the audiences of folks are going to be most inclined to make that donation to the organization. I think the main things people usually look at are similar organizations, people who might be donating. And this is all stuff that often with list rental companies, you can do exchanges with similar like-minded organizations, or you could purchase lists from folks, but they often look at who are similar organizations to yourself and who are the donors to those organizations, and could they be convinced to become new donors to your organization. And then it's through similar media. So often you might find that these folks perhaps all subscribe to Mother Jones, or all participate in other activities that is a natural just habit of these individuals that line up with the values of your organization. And if you are working with a list rental company, that often is not too prohibitively expensive, but they'll have a lot of data and analysis, but doing that audience targeting can be really helpful. So I think from there, any questions about that? Thoughts about that for now? If folks been doing direct mail, any ideas or other things folks have been thinking about in that area that they've done that has worked, hasn't worked?
Yeah, so Apano, last year we did a postcard with a QR code that led to our donation landing page. And because it was cost effective, it was a lighter lift for us at that time. And we attached a bit.ly to it so we would see how many people clicked on it. And it wasn't that many. It was probably mostly our development team clicking on that QR code. But it's nice to hear that what you were saying earlier about the long game of direct mail. And like there's certain data pieces that we just can't capture as far as like our donors getting like a cool piece of art and like having Apano be like getting that through the mail. So yeah, I think I like that piece of information.
Thank you, that's helpful. That's good to know. I mean, it's great that you did the bit.ly, so you have the data, so you're able to test it and see that if you did all that, even if it was a lower lift, but it was literally just your development team, and you do it maybe a couple more times, that's all you're getting. But yeah, maybe there's value as the multi-channel piece. And at the end of the day, I mean, maybe there isn't, but being able to test it and see. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I would share that so this is a question and a comment. I mean, we've had good success with segmenting our lists when we're doing direct mail appeals to existing donors or to lapsed or lost donors. And there's a number of ways we've really sort of stepped up our game and in terms of lots of segments. And it isn't a whole lot of extra work for me, and it seems to pay off. But that being said, we're not really doing that in terms of a large audience of donor prospects. And so I'm curious whether anyone has specific success or experience in using the segmentation tool or strategy and applying that to donor prospects and then, sort of converting prospects to donors.
Yeah, if I'm understanding correctly, you're thinking about in terms of segmentation for prospecting, you're thinking about these various audiences that you'd be like renting lists for or inviting to?
Well, so in our case, we have thousands of people that are subscribers or that are supporters of the work, not financial supporters, but engaged with us, partners, allies, etc., people that subscribe to our mail list. But we haven't, and we're working hard on this to figure out a way to do something new this year, but we haven't figured out how to accurately identify donor prospects successfully, rather than, not everybody is a donor prospect, and we're okay with that. We don't need to make everybody a donor, but there've got to be things that we're not doing that we could be within the current audience of people who like our mission and support our mission.
That's great. Yeah, and that feels, it's a perfect segue because it's mainly your email list that you're thinking about, and for donor conversion of how to get folks who are receiving your emails too. Yeah. Well, so a couple things come to mind there, and again, that's a perfect segue. And welcome others for thoughts you have of things that have worked or haven't worked. But one thing is that I think in my experience and in working on donor conversion has been, it is very difficult to get people from a place of littling email engagement to suddenly converting to becoming a donor. And by that, I mean, if you look back at the data, and what I love about digital engagement and email these days, and especially I've mostly used MailChimp, is that there's just infinite amounts of data that you can play with. But if you look and someone hasn't opened one of your emails for a year, they're not going to be the target that's going to then suddenly open an email and make a contribution. But if you can play with like looking at how you move those people through like a 3 or 4 prong tier where you're getting people that perhaps haven't opened an email in a while to maybe it's playing with subject lines, testing different things like that, but getting them to hopefully engage in some way. And then looking more around the segmenting of who are those that are engaging, who are opening emails and clicking through. The other thing that I'd note that has worked well with me for a couple of worked well with things I've done on a couple of occasions has been in trying to get people to just make that first hurdle is doing a low level ask and then making it a unique ask where it's something where I think a lot of us has probably done this, where it might be like the anniversary of an organization. So it's like an ask for $19.76. Or it could just be an ask for it's $3, where if you try and make it simple, try and find opportunities, whether it's through ActBlue or using tools like an Apple Pay to try and make the process as simple as possible, but really looking at something that's really low lift and compelling to get people to make that first donation. And then from there, trying to move up, but at least because email conversion can be really difficult. So I think those are a couple things I'm thinking about that have worked well for me in instances, but again, welcome others if you have ideas of things that have worked. And does that feel helpful, Ellen? Are those things that?
Yeah, it's helpful. It reminded me of a successful campaign that was fun for me because I got to do it secretly behind my boss's back. It was a 10th anniversary celebratory fundraising campaign. And so clearly we couldn't tell him about it. And I just got to call all the shots. So all kidding aside, the challenge there is that you have to know going into that retention is going to be low for some of those donors. So we did convert a lot of people to donors, but they were really donating because it was a campaign that was near and dear to their heart in terms of their relationship with our executive director, and so naturally, many of them fell off. So I think we do have some success there after more thought about it, but it was a very specific campaign.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, I touch on this in a couple different areas, but I think one of the values as well that you're touching on is just where there's opportunities for something that's topical or is going to be that specific hook, and being able to have communications for that moment. And also knowing, to your point, that you're not going to retain all those donors, but this is a game of data and margins. So with any luck, you were able to hopefully bring in a bunch of folks and then hopefully able to retain a small percent of those, but that hopefully some of those convert long term and you're able to hold on to those and then other opportunities present themselves. There's one organization a couple years ago during the uprisings after George Floyd that really stepped into leadership around that movement and was really seen. I mean, really did really powerful work around police reform in that movement and was seen in that way and connected with a lot of the visibility and was known and very visible around the work they were doing with something that was happening that was both critical and also topical. And that visibility led to them gaining tens of thousands of new donors. And they weren't able to retain naturally all those donors. It was a small percentage they were able to retain, but it was that the connection between, we don't get into it as much here, but I think it is also valuable, the connection of how naturally development is working with comms and having that understanding of what is going on with the organization, where that visibility is and where there are opportunities to be communicating with donors about their support for the organization. Trying to think of anything else around conversion. I mean, I think list building, there's a lot to feasibly get into around list building and being creative. I mean, it sounds say at this point, but I've had a decent amount of success just using some of those surveys that everyone's kind of sick of at this point. Surveys, or not necessarily surveys, but the petitions that everyone's a little bit sick of, and you kind of, you know, in the back of your mind wonder, why am I filling out this petition? It's not going to do anything. But I mean, sometimes they do, and people still sign up for them. I think what I've seen with the organizations where it's worked best is where you have a campaign where you're building out a petition around an issue, but then you actually wrap the campaign. I've had an organization I worked with where we would do petitions, and it would kind of just, we'd have the petition and you would never hear of it again. And then I've seen some organizations, I think Color of Change, if folks know them, does this really well, where they will run a petition campaign, have tens of thousands of people sign it, and then have a moment where they will be on the steps of the White House or the steps of the Capitol talking about all the signatures that they gained around an issue. And that feels to me like it's been really successful in driving their really strong donor program. So I think things like that as well, but I think also looking at the ability, how you're able to grow your email list. And then it's, again, this game with margins, but playing with these, we were talking about Ellen and trying to convert. Touching on social media, and again, a lot of this is somewhat high level, but able to dig into. What I've seen with social media has been that it mostly does not work for a direct acquisition, but it is a great strategy as a complement, as part of the whole program, and again, for list building. That it's much easier to get someone to jump from your social media to sign up to receiving your emails than it is to get them to donate. And that would be the pathway there, is trying to get people from all your social platforms to either perhaps sign that petition and get them to sign up for an email. I think that's another thing when looking at list building is everywhere possible that someone could sign up for your emails happening. Like I've played with at different times, if there is that new report that's coming out, asking people to provide their email, or at least giving them the option to provide their email to sign up for something before they click through to get the report. But every creative opportunity to find where someone could sign up to receive your emails is really powerful to try and grow that list. The other thing I would quickly note in that regard is that you also will find, especially if you get a hit on something and it's very topical, like there was a report with one organizations we put out around debt-free college that resonated with a lot of people, and we were able to build a really strong new list of folks. And as one can imagine, those folks were very particularly interested in that issue. So it meant that we had to continue to have them as a segment, as we were talking about, and communicate with them to that degree, but then also knowing that, being able to leverage that and try and convert them to support that. It might have been just that work in particular, but knowing that and holding on to that to be able to have conversion. And then wrapping up here, just audience targeting and testing everything you can, especially with digital. There's so much that you can do with testing, that being able to look at those pieces. I would say with really any email I would send out, we would do some kind of test, whether it was a subject line, whether it was framing or looking at hyperlinks, but doing some kind of test to see how things are resonating. And again, I think there's some high level common themes that will probably come through, but at the same time, it's also unique to your audience and building out what is actually resonating with your universe of folks. So then from there, and I'm realizing we're going a little long, so I'm gonna move through to some other pieces. So let's talk about events for a moment. So in terms of events, there's so much to feasibly talk about here. I think the things to highlight that I wanted to mention in terms of events for acquisition purposes is that, again, it is another piece of the puzzle to think about and how this complements all the other activities of what you're doing. I think they naturally present opportunities for the peer-to-peer engagement. And that it's also, as we were talking about with direct mail, it's thinking about and doing that analysis around return on investment. I've seen a lot of organizations that have stepped back. At my most recent organization, we stepped back from doing a gala. I think that's a direction that could go either way about in terms of the return on investment and the value there. But I think what I've seen, this is similar to kind of what we were talking about with the postcard strategy around direct mail, is that there's a lot of opportunities to do things that are feasibly a lot lower lift. Whereas people right now coming out of the worst of COVID, I guess I should say, is that there is exactly, fingers crossed, is that they're more eager for the in-person interactions. And I think it is both that coupled with the fact that there is a heavy saturation of virtual engagement that's happening. There's a significant amount of educational opportunities, of engagement with leaders of all kinds. So it's increasingly difficult to have virtual events that are going to resonate with folks, get attendance, and that are necessarily going to translate into conversion for donors. So I think in that, I hold ROI close in that for whatever thing that we're doing, what do we really think we'll be able to achieve in terms of the number of new donors we might bring in, and how are we spending money accordingly and investing? And are we spending too much time, too much money? Is this too much of a logistical burden we're not going to bring them? But what I would say is that the two things that, especially looking at virtual events, but I think this also translates to in person, two things I'd say that I think that are working well in this moment are, one, celebrity, in however you want to define that, but having some form of person who would be a celebrity for your community and your audience, and you leveraging that as a draw, which I think we've always kind of known, but I think that's increasingly important. And then similar to that, I would say like celebrity of topic. So, and by that, what I mean is, I think the best way to explain it would be, so we, at my last organization, we did a lot of voting rights litigation. And we had one of our lawyers who was an expert in a particular area of voting rights litigation. And I think at one point it was the case that we had that was in Minnesota that was critical in terms of what was happening in the lead up to the 2020 election. And this person, most people had no idea who this person was. But if you were interested in what was happening in voting rights elections in that moment in the lead up to 2020, it was a topic that you knew this person was an expert on, and it was really attractive to attend the session and get this face-to-face time with this person and be able to ask them questions about what was actually happening on the ground with this litigation. And I think that translates to all of our organizations and the work that we're doing, that we can probably name people who are the experts and probably have a level of expertise that would be really fascinating for folks. And being able to create that space, especially if something topical comes up, like there is something with urgency or a win of some kind, and having that moment. And again, also looking at the ROI, I don't think these things need to be fancy. Like it's really you having, hey, our attorney or our program lead who's been working on this issue around healthcare, this new thing is happening, this thing is in the news. We're throwing this opportunity together to just talk about what this is, and getting people to come in and have that conversation can also be, to your point, Suzanne, an easy way if you're just inviting an email list of folks where people can come in, ask questions, and engage with this person who could be a celebrity in the sense of what the program is.
David, can I just add a really quick thing about events?
Please.
I think events really span the gamut. So there's galas, very, high end, fancy, a lot of money, a lot of time, very complicated to organize. And then there's just, jump on a Zoom call with this expert, as David was referring to, those kind of things with these topical, really timely things. You can get some of your donors to show up because they want to hear from someone, but it doesn't, again, that's where a digital or an online event can be effective if it's just like a town hall, a Q&A with the ED, something like that, very simple. So there are ways to engage people that keeps them connected. It's not necessarily as a big fundraising opportunity, but it's that engagement that leads to better fundraising.
Yeah, please, Suzanne. Oh, yeah, Suzanne and then Jennifer. Sound good?
Yeah, we do a lot of town halls, public forum kind of things with our coalition partners. Now, when we do it virtually, it's statewide. When we do them in person, it's more like by county. And I haven't figured out the best way to we don't want it to be like a fundraiser, but I do want to invite them to donate to support the mission. So what are some good strategies that you would recommend, either like at the time of the event or even in the follow-up of the event, to start that conversation with people who would be new?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. I very much welcome others and what's worked well for you. I mean, in my experience, it's also kind of gauging the moment in the room and how it feels to include an ask that's happening in the space. When possible, like including an ask and making that connection of what it would be supporting. I mean, naturally, always feels important. And then, I mean, certainly with follow-up, I think I go back a little to the qualification piece as well. And this is, I think, talking about with, we had a large, at my last organization, we had a new president come in and we did a large virtual gala in a sense for the new president. And we didn't raise a lot of money. We didn't have a lot of people attend. But at the end of the day, there were like 3 people who were there, who were the people we wanted to be there and who had a great experience. And that was the goal at the end of the day, with those 3 people had that experience. So I think also thinking about that also comes to mind, like, are there specific folks in which perhaps it's just being able to acquire those folks is a big value, and being able to kind of know who those folks are and following up with them. But what do others think?
Thank you.
That meshes a lot with what we've been seeing. I'm sorry, you're not done, Suzanne. I'm talking.
Go for it.
That meshes a lot with what we've been seeing. We've been doing sort of donor briefings, virtual donor briefings across the pandemic. We'd been doing them before. We got much more intentional with them, and had been doing them only for upper level donors. The last couple of, like the last year and a half, actually, I opened them up to all donors with the thought that, like, hey, why not use this as a cultivation opportunity? And we've been trying to fine tune how to make them a acquisition tool also. It's like a conversion tool. So we will send out, we do a weekly newsletter through our comms department. So we'll include, like the week before, we'll include that with a note that, like, hey, this is open to all NJPP donors. If you're not one, or if you aren't sure of your current status, contact Jennifer. And we're, picking up a handful of folks, which is good. Sometimes it's a donation of, $5, but hey, that's $5 we didn't have before. And it's a relatively low lift, and we're kind of working with the same sort of model for we're doing a, calling it Budget and Brews happy hour in June. And like, I'm looking at your list of things, David, I'm like, oh, I'm doing this right. Because it's low lift organizationally. It's, we got a room at one of the bars in town. But we got a low level, the author of Billionaire Boondoggle is a friend of the organization. He's relatively close by. We've got a corporate business tax surcharge, which is about to expire. So it's timely here in New Jersey, especially since it's going to leave like $1 billion hole in the budget. So yeah, we're building a lot of campaign around that. So we've got something that's topical. We've got a low level celebrity. We're making it a very low level, like, just come and join us, sort of a thing. But the hope is that we can start converting some of these people who maybe are supporters of some of our partners, or maybe just sort of know us through our comms work and that sort of thing, into donors moving forward. I was very fortunate that our board really listened when I'm like, look, we did not do what we wanted with ticket sales last year. So we cut our sponsorship goal back. We got rid of our ticket sales goal for income for this year, and I'm focusing on raising a discrete amount of money, doing 2 much smaller events. We'll see how it goes. But the hope is that by removing cost barriers to ticketing, we can get a broader audience and a new audience from what we've seen in the past. We'll see if it works. I'm hoping.
No, that's great. Yeah, I've definitely seen the same thing. Having much more casual events that are more accessible for folks to come to, and keeping it cheap. Yeah, we did with organization I work with, DWP I'm working with now, we did an event in New York that was just meant to be casual in person, but invested a decent amount of time and energy. And we got about 15 people to show up, which was great. So we're trying to do it again this year, but there's no real for 15 people, and hopefully some more than that for like a random Thursday night. Like, there's no need to spend 20 grand putting something together. Keep it cheap, keep it casual, just have space for people to connect. So we're running, I have a couple more slides of things I wanted to cover. The next area I wanted to chat about was just in general, like peer-to-peer staff and board engagement and opportunities of kind of quote unquote junior structures. We're running a little bit behind on time. So the plan was that we were going to then go to breakout groups, talk in like smaller groups about some things and come back. We're a relatively small group. Like, should we, folks feel like breakout groups are not necessary? We can just keep the conversation going and see what, if, I mean, the next questions would be like, how after this slide, talk a little bit more and then see how these have been, if any of this is applicable, resonating, diving deeper into some particular areas. And then again, the end goal is that hopefully there's some ideas here that folks are able to bring back and that are helpful to what your next steps are. That generally sound good?
Yeah, that
Let's
sounds
do
good
it.
to me. I'm gonna have to leave in about 15 minutes. So,
Okay,
but staying with the group sounds good.
okay, cool. Thank you for letting us know. So yeah, so I think that the main things in terms of peer-to-peer engagement that I wanted to highlight here, particularly working with boards, is that I've always worked with this model of what I call ABCs. And what I mean by that is this kind of breaking out, and I use board, but it could be any kind of structure. This is also with like any kind of peer-to-peer fundraising or volunteer network fundraising that you're thinking about, is that I think about 3 tiers. One tier is a group of individuals that you probably know as a person on your board, who is a really great fundraiser, really engaged in the work, and doesn't necessarily need a lot of help doing that. Like, you can provide some support, but they're going to be out there doing it. And then you have another tier, the third tier of folks. I don't, it's not intentional putting these like 1, 2, 3. It's like next to each other. But an additional section of folks who are not going to do a lot of fundraising. They're either a community leader that doesn't have the networks or capacity, and they're participating in your organization or your board in different ways and bringing multiple different values, but it's not going to be fundraising. And that's being able to acknowledge that. Because I think often going into peer-to-peer engagement, like with a volunteer list or with a board, that we try and go after everyone. And I think what's key here is that then this middle category of where are there folks that you think have some energy and some engagement, and with your additional time, knowing that none of us have any time, that with that time, those are going to be the best folks, that if you spend your time, they're going to be able, like, they have the network, but they haven't really been engaged with, or that you feel like there is some genuine opportunity, that how do we identify that middle group of folks? And that's where we focus our time. And I look at this with acquisition as well, because I've done plenty of programs with board members where we would put massive structures together and create lists and charts and updates about who was giving from networks, from board members. And at the end of the day, it was 3 or 4 folks who were doing most of it. And that by spending the time with them, they were the ones that were able to provide new donors, new opportunities for the organization. So this is really just making this point of, and does that resonate a little bit when you think about your boards or your networks of volunteers? Like, these people aren't doing much, these people are doing a ton, but if I really focus here, yeah. So I feel like that's always been important for, yeah.
Can I just add a little counterpoint, just
Yeah.
interest of debate here? So I think you're right. I mean, 100% board involvement is rare. On the other hand, I think one thing that I've seen be useful is there are often board members who have actually solicited their networks or been on many other boards, and they just can't go back to their friends one more time for one more organization. But if you say to them, okay, we have current donors who aren't well connected to anyone yet, can we assign them to you to cultivate and steward and solicit? And they have their own group of donors who they may not have known before they joined the board. There will be people sometimes willing to do that. So I just need to think about not thinking of fundraising as one thing and board members do it or not, but what is the piece that they can work with. So just to be a little more creative, and even inviting them to say, what do you feel comfortable engaging with? If it's not bringing your friends in, is there something else? But I know we're talking about donor acquisition now, so I don't want to get too off track there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, I definitely have had those people in the category that are just not going to be able to bring a lot of value, but at the same time, they were one of the most powerful speakers at an event that we did. And they weren't able to bring in a lot of new donors, but they were able to participate in other ways. And then I think all this, in terms of this section, what I think all this leads to is this concept of, in general, the more people who are acting as fundraisers in some way for your organization, the better, and the more donors you're going to be able to bring in. Ideally, new donors, as we're talking about. So I think that's this work with the board members, that's work with any kind of volunteer or peer-to-peer engagement and having an understanding of making sure where resources are best spent. And then I wanted to mention here just this opportunity of the same concept of a junior structure. So I say junior in the sense that I did with a couple organizations ago, we created what we called the National Action Council, which was a group of folks who had some affinity to the organization. It was almost like these middle category of folks who weren't actually on the board. And for various reasons, they were folks that we were thinking about, like in the future could be good for the board, folks that probably would never be on the board, but were just really active volunteers that wanted to be engaged at a higher level. But by being able to create some level of community and giving a title to it, it gave it that much more like gravitas that encouraged these people to be out there in the world, identifying more deeply with the organization. And at the end, it was 20 to 30 people that had that deep identification that were talking about the organization and doing fundraising for us. And it was tricky. So it was trying to manage, like, how am I as a development director able to manage this whole group, like in aggregate, so this doesn't make a ton of work that's not manageable. But the goal of creating, and it's, I use that term loosely, but are there volunteer structures? Are there other structures to think about? With this basic concept of getting more people to be fundraising for the organization.
This is Laura with Children's for a Healthy Future. I'm sorry to join late. But I guess, how often did you kind of pull that advisory group together, and what did that look like kind of on a regular basis?
Yeah, so when we had that, it was roughly quarterly meetings, and it was just an hour-long meeting that we would have that was more relational and engagement, talking about upcoming events, have like the executive director join to just make sure that relationship and engagement happened. We would have, like, where there were opportunities, if you had like a conference or an event that people attended and you had badges, for example, like where there were opportunities to acknowledge them, or even if it was like a house party where someone would acknowledge board members, they would be acknowledged as well. So there was a little bit where we could find creative ways of acknowledging them, but it was about a quarterly meeting for about an hour. But the idea was to relatively keep it light, but have a pretty solid engagement to keep people engaged.
Great, thank you.
So zooming out a little bit, how does this all sound? What are you thinking about? Is there anything that comes to mind in particular that feels like something you could take back, apply? Any further questions about things or areas that we didn't dig into enough that would be good to touch on more? It sounds like there's some stuff that a lot of stuff folks are already doing. What about, can I ask about then, when you're doing this acquisition work, what kind of challenges are you experiencing? Is it in the planning? Is it in the, like, having budget and just bandwidth to even do anything further around acquisition? Yep.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask that question too, David, about how many of you actually budget for acquisition? Like you say, we're going to spend 5,000, 2,000, 10,000 this year on whatever strategies, whether it's direct mail or some kind of events that cost some money, just for the purpose of acquisition. Do you do that at all? Worth thinking about, right?
Most of our acquisition is trying to convert from our email list. It's trying to convert from good comms. It's trying to convert from events that we're already having for other reasons. So like our budget for acquisition is hard baked into our budget for re-engaging lost donors through lapse mailings. It's built into broadening our mailing list for a event. It's, things like that. So there's no particular line, which would probably be a helpful thing to think about.
Looks like Suzanne might have had a comment or question.
Sorry. Yeah, similarly, this conversation again underscores the importance of just more focus on retention, because when I think about taking on all of these other things, it's like, how am I gonna have the bandwidth to do that and do the retention piece? So if I'm gonna choose one, I'm gonna stick with the retention. But it is helpful to kind of have these seeds planted in my mind of like when seeing other opportunities or thinking about, like, we're about to do a board retreat this spring. If there's like a 5-year plan or something that comes out of that, then, you know, maybe it makes sense to start that direct mail piece to kind of grow with it. But that's, yeah. It's helpful, and this is just a great like tee up for the conversations we're going to be having with the board at the board retreat. So yeah, thanks.
Of course, of course. Are there things, can I ask a little bit about what you're doing? I'm just wondering if there's stuff you might already be doing and there's things we could think about that might be able to, you know, without a lot more time adding on to that might help with acquisition stuff.
Yeah, go ahead,
I've
Sue.
been curious about Google Ads and doing that kind of in consort with promotion for some of the public forums or other things that we're having, just because it's free advertising. Has anyone had experience with that?
Yeah, definitely. Do you run that or does the comms team run that? I mean, in coordination with
We don't have a comms team. We're
Oh,
a very small
okay.
shop, so it would be me.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think Google Ads is fantastic. Yeah,
Okay.
being able to leverage that. I think when I've used Google Ads in the past, it's worked best when it was, again, as topical and we're able to use it communicating about whatever the specific issue was in the moment, and that it corresponded with other communications of things we were doing. But yeah, as a free tool, I think it works really, really well.
Yeah, thanks.
David, I wanted to address one thing that people raised about when you have events that aren't fundraising events, but people are coming to them because they're interested in your issue or they're on your email list or on some other list. I see a lot of money being left on the table because people aren't making a pitch. And if you feel like it really is not appropriate to make a pitch, to even say, you know, many of you have been regular donors or many of you have been supporters over the years. We appreciate that. This is not a fundraising event, but we want you to know how much your support means to us. Like just to remind people that we're able to do the work because of you. And you can be part of the solution by supporting us. And it can be a soft pitch like that, or it can be a direct, you know, please give now and here's a link or QR code or whatever you're using. So I think I would err on the side of reminding people about giving more than not talking about it, even if it's to acknowledge the giving. But I think we forget that people tend to give money because they're asked. And so having all the wonderful information in the world doesn't lead to a gift unless you say, and in addition to all this great stuff we're doing, could you support us? So just maybe consider that. So you're not having to create a whole acquisition program, Jennifer, but you could add more solicitations onto things you're already doing. I didn't mean to pick on you. I was just responding.
No. And I've been working with our new president to get her as comfortable as possible with making exactly that pitch happen. And she did it without me pushing her at our gala last year. So I will take that as
kind of on that same note, I would call it a small win. One thing that we've done is we send out like a weekly legislative update during our session. So Georgia's session is 40 days long. It's very short. So it spans like January to March. And we do a weekly update each week about what's happening in the bills people might care about in the healthcare space. And a couple times during the session, usually at the beginning, middle, and end, we'll do like a plug that's like, we really like bringing these to you guys. It takes us a lot of hard work, and our monthly donors help support that. You know, please consider giving once or monthly. And, you know, we probably only get like 1 or 2 donations from each of those, but we're doing the emails anyway. So we just put it at the top each a couple times during session, and it seems to have worked pretty well.
Nice.
I think emails, yeah, as you were talking about, Suzanne, I mean, you're already doing the emails. That feels like it's a good place that if there's opportunities that maybe being able to convert folks there could be an avenue. I mean, that can also be tricky. Are there things you've seen that have worked, or emails you've sent out when you're like, oh, we did get some donations on this one?
Yeah, the ones that, like Lara was saying, that are a little bit like, we always have the donate button on every email we send out and other things like that, but we don't have like a pitch or any like text that goes with it that, you know, connects the everything, all the other content with that donation and what that support means. So whenever we do, we tend to get more like a handful of donations. So we've been trying to do that, but sometimes just the speed of getting it out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that could be interesting. Why don't we dig in there? And I would love if y'all have ideas about this as well. But in terms of just email practices, so for example, I mean, it's been a couple of years since I've looked at this data, but the rule of thumb I was going with was a line of 5 words was best. I always just knowing that, you know, open rate is the first place to start. So beyond subject line, what I would say is the rule of thumb I always have, but what's 5 words for an increased open rate on emails. And then the other thing that I always had seen was by varying the senders. So if it's always your executive director who's sending the email, by having it come from a new person that people might not have met before, that always pushed open rates up. It's like a different program person it might be coming from and telling their story and perspective. And then the other thing I would say that is more in my experience that I'm seeing data around, but also having the more strange subject lines. So we did a year-end email, fundraising email, where the subject line was just the word shoes, which was very odd, but then it was a story that connected this person's love of shoes to their love of organizing. So the whole story was there, but it let us put this very silly subject line, and it had one of the best open rates we've seen in a long time. I mean, naturally, but so things like that, perhaps for open rate, could be interesting to think about. And those are easy things to feasibly do, to just play with that and see what feasibly works for you. There's always the forward trick, like if you're sending an email and then you change up the subject line so it says forward on it, just to, I mean, that's a little tricky to get people to open your emails, but those can often work.
I'm sorry, David, when you say, do you mean to asking people to forward a message to other people?
Oh, no, thanks for that. I mean, if you were to send, like you could set it up in MailChimp, but the subject line, you would manually type in FW colon. So when people get it, it looks like a forward.
Oh, okay.
Which is a little tricky. And it could be, you know, sometimes, especially around year end, it could be like a want to make sure you saw this email we sent last week, but putting the FW colon in a subject line, it could be a good way to try and game that a little bit to increase open rates. Were you going to add something, Jennifer? Yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say we had a lot of success. Was it 2 years ago? I've talked about this before. Lame duck is a big thing here in Jersey, certain times of the year, or every 2 years. And we had a lot of stuff going on, and we had a donor call, which we also used as our Giving Tuesday plug, that we called What the Duck. And we saw some of our best engagement with those emails, especially once we had, you know, around Thanksgiving. So it was all leading up to Giving Tuesday, and around Thanksgiving, the email subject line was "Forget about the turkey, we're all about the duck." And yeah, so, and it also was a lovely opportunity for me to spend entire emails making terrible duck puns. So people were actually reading them,
yeah,
which was nice. So, and it was fun to write, if nothing else. But you know, we're Jersey, so we can kind of lean into the salty language and the big shoulders.
I've also seen, so just looking at open rates though right now, I've seen people play, I've seen this both work and not work, so it's something you could feasibly test, but it could, using emojis and subject lines is something that you could try. And then also using people's names. I think in MailChimp, you're able to, in a subject line, do insert name, which I'd test. And that feels really creepy to me. I haven't seen data on it recently, but that's something you can test and see if that resonates with folks. Oh, sure thing. Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, and then beyond open rates, just looking at the click-through rate then. So you get people to open the email, how do you get them to click through? And there, I think, again, it goes back to testing in who your universe is and you're working with. And things that I always test are length of email, depending on who the audience is. Like in my previous organization, we were a think tank and people liked really long, like my instinct was not, this is way too long, but that's what the testing showed, that people liked that. And then, previous to that, I was at a more of an activist organization and the trend was for much shorter emails. So try just length of email could be a great thing to see. I think it's I don't know how informative or helpful this is, but it's always, even the length of the email, making sure that you have whatever the call to action is, whether that's a donation or any other call to action, still at the top. So it could be a 2-page email, but you're at least having that link for a call to action that's very close to the top is critical for those people that you do lose as they're reading it. I'd also think about hyperlinks. I mean, that's always a fun game to play and test. Like some people, the numbers can go up if you have like a naked hyperlink where you just show like the long URL versus the link to is something you could feasibly play with and see if it resonates with folks and you get more people to click through. Sometimes just literally saying click here versus just having a hyperlink, being more directive and telling people specifically what to do is an interesting thing to feasibly test. Any other ideas or thoughts or things that have worked well for y'all? Okay.
I have a quick question for folks. If anyone has used, because I know peer-to-peer campaigns weren't listed high on what you all were interested in talking about, but I do think peer-to-peer fundraising is one of the more effective ways to get new donors that isn't cost intensive, especially if you do like virtual campaigns. And if you can get enough people involved in asking their friends to give. So I'm just curious, the three of you who are left, if you've played around with that at all as a way to acquire donors.
Not here. 2 jobs ago, we did a lot of peer-to-peer and it was fairly effective. We did a lot of, donate your day sort of whatnots, which worked really well, but they weren't necessarily sticky donors. It was a lot of, I'll give once to get my friend off my back.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll give once next year when my friend bugs me again because it's their birthday again. But they weren't people we were seeing engagement with otherwise necessarily. But that also could have been the nature of the org. It's very different from where I am now.
We're testing out, or we're planning to test out in May, doing a peer-to-peer. Because we're an advocacy group, we feel like Giving Tuesdays maybe like not our best time because we don't have like puppies and babies. And so, I mean, we do as a staff, but not for our organization. So we're trying one in May, around like, we're trying to decide kind of which issue area we'd like to highlight as part of that day. But if you guys have tips, I know the advice we've gotten so far is like making our like ask team as big as possible, and making sure they are prepped for the day. But if there's any other advice on that, I welcome it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm resonating with what you're saying, Jennifer, around all the noise. And where my head is that on Giving Tuesday, you have to do something because there's just so much activity and movement happening. And at the same time, it goes back to like this ROI question of I mean, a couple of organizations ago, we would do a lot and we would try and mobilize folks and it was good. And we were able to bring in some new donors and it was a heavy lift. So it's always that balance of what the engagement is. And I think having a real conversation about, okay, we have 10 people who want to help us fundraise and are excited about Giving Tuesday, and doing the hard look at, okay, are these people really, do we think they're going to deliver and they're going to bring in folks, or these are people who saying they're excited and energized and not much happen. So I've definitely seen that. But I also think, like, as much as Giving Tuesday frustrates me at times, I will every year send out an email on Giving Tuesday without a doubt. But yeah, but what's your experience, Jennifer? Similar?
I hate Giving Tuesday with a fiery passion. It is the hallmark holiday, or the sweetest day of philanthropy. I think I actually referred to it as in an email once. But yeah, like it's just such a noisy time of year, but you have to do something or the board will be mad at you. Inevitably. I think the idea of doing something topical in May sounds like a great idea, like great idea. And if you can get people on board with actually making calls for you and like connecting with people for you, that's the key. Yeah, Giving Tuesday.
Laura, were you saying you're doing it as one day in May? Because one advantage to have a peer-to-peer that's not related to Giving Tuesday is you can make it over a period of weeks or even, you know, a month long. You know, the month of May is going to be our peer-to-peer campaign, and not longer than that, but one day feels hard
Yeah.
because people either do it or they don't, and then it's come and gone.
Yeah, we talked about doing it like kind of over like a weekend or like start on Thursday, you know, try to finish up by Monday, that kind of thing. But yeah, kind of focusing on a day. But having some like, you know, some trail that can leaves the door open for a couple of days.
I have found that, I mean, this is more crowdfunding than peer-to-peer even, but like having all a bunch of pieces in place first. So like, I'm gonna ask you for this day. Can you do it that day? So you know that you'll get a response and you'll build energy around it. It's, you know, it's like having a paddle raise at a silent auction. You need to know that at least somebody's going to raise their paddle at your first level, or like it's full. Not that I'm speaking from experience. But I would spend some time like lining that up.
That's good to know. We can definitely, right now we're working on kind of putting together our like ask team for the day. So we will advise the ask team to send out their asks maybe like a week early and say, like, on this day.
So is there any other, we're kind of getting to time, and I think Stephanie Ombar, is there a few words you want to mention at the end about anything upcoming?
I think just the words is, I'll send you the email that I sent you, Laura and Jennifer. You've attended this many enough, so you'll get my nice little email about surveys. Please fill it out, and then you'll get the recording of this training and materials that David will share with you all next week.
Right. Okay. Well, I hope this was helpful. I hope this gave some ideas of easier ways to hopefully apply some ideas and bring in some new donors. Yeah. And it was great to good to see you, Jennifer. Great to meet you, Laura.
Yeah, really enjoyed hearing from all of you. That was very inspiring.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you guys.
Have a wonderful
Bye, Jen.